You're about to witness a moment that didn't just challenge one politician, it cracked open the very way America listens to women in power. What started as a calm, televised policy debate between Karoline Leavitt and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett turned into a national reckoning. The second, a hidden tape began to play. There were no outbursts, no shouting matches, just one sentence spoken in private that the whole country wasn't supposed to hear. And when it aired, it didn't just expose a strategy, it exposed a system. Because in that moment, millions of Americans finally saw how political silence is often staged and who it's meant to silence. If you've ever felt ignored in a boardroom, spoken over in a courtroom, or dismissed because you were too emotional to lead, this story is for you. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment if you've ever been told you didn't sound qualified enough to be heard. Because tonight, one woman didn't raise her voice. She simply hit play and let the country hear what they were never meant to. It was a brisk evening in Washington, D.C., the kind of cold that makes even seasoned locals pull their collars higher and step a little quicker between buildings. But inside the historic Liberty Hall, warmth buzzed not from heaters, but from anticipation. Rows of cushioned chairs faced a raised stage, backlit with subtle patriotic hues. Banners read, "Education and Accountability in America." But those words felt ironic to anyone paying attention, because this wasn't just any policy forum. This was the stage set for a collision, one carefully choreographed by handlers, press agents, and power brokers behind the scenes. A televised event featuring two rising political voices, Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in American history, a fiery, fast-talking conservative with a knack for striking sound bites, and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a fierce advocate for education reform, known for her intellect, grace under fire, and unflinching moral compass. From the outside, it was billed as a balanced debate, but from the moment the lights came on, it felt more like a trial. The room itself held quiet tension, like the hush before a verdict is read. The audience was mixed, but leaned conservative. Older Americans made up the bulk, war veterans in clean-pressed jackets, retired teachers with notepads in hand, grandmothers in Sunday-best scarves. These were people who had lived through decades of American political transformation: Vietnam, Watergate, the fall of the Berlin Wall, September 11th, and more recently, years of bitter ideological divides and nonstop headlines. They hadn't come to watch a performance, they came for answers. But what they got was something no one expected. Karoline took center stage, seated in a polished leather chair under a warm halo of light. Her blouse was crisp, her tone sharper than usual, like a knife wrapped in velvet. Every word was calculated, controlled. The media team had rehearsed this for days. Jasmine, by contrast, was positioned slightly off to the side. Her chair was lower, her light dimmer. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone who had spent a lifetime being told to speak when spoken to. The moderator began with a soft question about educational inequality. Karoline answered first. "We all want our children to succeed," she began, smiling. "But the real problem isn't money. It's discipline. It's structure. It's having leaders who understand systems, not just slogans." A few nods, one short clap. Then came the line that cut deeper. "I respect Representative Crockett's presence here, but to be honest, I don't believe she has the qualifications necessary to lead a national reform effort." Silence. Not a gasp, not a murmur, just a ripple of stunned stillness, as if the room collectively wondered, did she just say that? In that moment, a generation of women, particularly older women in the audience, recoiled quietly. They'd heard that tone before, the tone that says, "You're allowed to be here, just not as an equal." Jasmine didn't flinch, she didn't blink. She kept her hands folded neatly in her lap and her eyes on the moderator. Some in the crowd might have mistaken her stillness for weakness, but others recognized it for what it was: a decision. In the sound booth above the hall, a 24-year-old intern named Maya Torres adjusted the levels on her mixer. Her job was simple: ensure clear audio for broadcast. But Maya was watching closely. She saw the cut of Karoline's gaze. She saw the way the moderator didn't pause or ask Jasmine to respond. She saw how, once again, power was being framed as poise and dignity as silence. And that's when Maya remembered something. 3 days earlier, she had been tasked with labeling audio files from pre-show prep. One of the files caught her attention. It was a behind-the-scenes mic check. Karoline was speaking with her strategist. "She'll react," Karoline had said. "They always do. You just have to prod. Make it look like a discussion, not an attack. And if she bites, that's your proof she can't lead." At the time, Maya had flagged it as strategic chatter. Now, it sounded more like a setup. Down on the stage, Karoline was on her third talking point, hammering away about data-driven reform and emotional grandstanding. And Jasmine, still quiet. To some, her silence felt awkward. To others, it felt sacred. She wasn't here to win applause. She was waiting for something else, something bigger than rebuttal. She was waiting for truth to expose itself, not through argument, but through time. Maya looked at the backup file again. It was only 41 seconds, but in those seconds lived intent. Intent to provoke, intent to humiliate, intent to brand someone unfit before they ever spoke. She looked toward the control room director and whispered, "If it escalates, we might need to play this." The director looked puzzled. "What is it?" A moment they never expected would be recorded. And on that stage, as the cameras rolled and the world watched, Karoline Leavitt smiled. Jasmine Crockett stayed still. And somewhere deep in the audio system, the truth waited on a USB. The debate was entering its second phase, and something had changed in the air. Karoline Leavitt leaned forward, her body language firm, commanding, almost theatrical. She knew the cameras were rolling, and she knew how to use them. Every gesture, every pause was intentional. Her next words would be clipped, edited, and shared online by midnight. She was sure of it. "You know," she said, turning slightly toward Jasmine, though never addressing her directly, "it's not enough to just care. Passion without strategy leads nowhere. Leadership isn't about feeling. It's about executing." The audience responded with scattered applause. Older attendees nodded, some with arms crossed, reassured by the firmness in her tone. Karoline's strategy was clear: frame Jasmine not as an opponent, but as an emotional symbol, a figure unfit to shape real policy. Jasmine still said nothing, but in that silence, something stirred. It wasn't confusion or uncertainty. It was something older viewers in that room understood intimately: restraint. The kind of restraint that comes from years of biting your tongue to keep your job. The kind that held marriages together through decades of sacrifice. The kind that didn't yell back in school board meetings, but remembered every condescending glance. Backstage, Maya watched Jasmine with increasing awe. She recognized something few others had the wisdom to see. Jasmine wasn't disengaged. She was choosing her moment. Karoline, sensing no opposition, surged forward again. When you put emotion at the center of policy, you get slogans instead of systems. You get people who look like leaders, but when the cameras turn off, they have nothing left to offer. She smiled at the moderator, then added with a soft chuckle, "Some people want to be heard, others want to actually lead." A quiet, approving laugh echoed from the left corner of the room. Maya's stomach turned. In the control booth, the director looked at her. "Is it time?" Maya hesitated. "Not yet. Let her walk right into it." Jasmine finally moved. She shifted her weight and gently unfolded her hands. Her eyes rose to meet Karoline's for the first time that evening. There was no heat, no smirk, no tremble, just quiet clarity. And then she spoke. "I find it interesting," Jasmine said softly, "that strength is always defined by the ones who already hold the microphone." The room froze. The moderator blinked. Karoline sat straighter. Jasmine turned, not toward her opponent, but toward the audience. "When I was a public defender, I saw kids labeled as unfit before they ever stepped into a classroom. When I ran for office, people said I was too passionate to survive the halls of Congress. And now I sit here once again, being told that because I don't interrupt, I don't belong." No one clapped, no one moved. Jasmine looked directly at the moderator. "So, I have a question, if I may." The moderator nodded cautiously. Jasmine placed a small USB stick on the table. "I'd like to play something. Just 41 seconds. It was recorded 3 days ago. I didn't come here to shame anyone. But I think the audience deserves to understand the full context of what's happening here tonight." "Oh," Karoline visibly stiffened. "What is that?" she asked, her voice more clipped than before. Jasmine turned to the tech booth. Maya gave the nod. The screen behind the stage went black. A play icon blinked on the corner. Then, without music, without graphics, without warning, Karoline's voice filled the hall. "She'll spiral. They always do. Play calm, then strike. Keep the camera on her. Once she's rattled, smile. And if she cries, game over. Say she's unfit." The room didn't gasp. It exhaled. A collective breath held too long, finally released. Karoline tried to speak, but the moderator raised a hand. "Let the audio finish." The recording continued. "It doesn't matter how many degrees she has. Emotion is weakness. If she's weak, she doesn't deserve to lead." Silence. Total, suffocating silence. And then the screen went dark. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply leaned forward and said, "I've had that recording for 3 days. I wasn't going to use it, but when I was told, again, that I didn't belong here unless I fit someone else's mold of what a leader should sound like, I realized something." She paused, her voice gentle but unshakable. "Silence isn't always neutral. Sometimes it's complicity." People in the audience began to shift. Some were blinking back tears. Others, older men and women, crossed their arms tightly, as if holding in a lifetime of being told they were too much, or not enough. Karoline opened her mouth, but her mic let out a high-pitched screech, feedback from the rushed audio reset. The moderator didn't move to fix it. And Jasmine, she sat back, folded her hands once again, and looked out at the audience with the calm of a woman who knew she no longer needed to raise her voice. Because the truth had already spoken. The screen had gone black, but the weight of the moment hadn't lifted. It pressed down on the audience like an invisible fog, thick, silent, inescapable. Older attendees sat with arms folded, not out of defiance, but out of decades of knowing exactly what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't just a slip. It wasn't just an out-of-context remark. It was a rehearsed tactic, caught on tape. And suddenly, everything Karoline had said before the playback felt reframed. Jasmine hadn't had to explain it. The recording did all the work. People who had spent their lives trying to play by the rules, to be composed, gracious, non-reactive, now stared at the stage with a different kind of recognition. Because for once, it wasn't their silence being mistaken for weakness. It was someone else's voice being revealed as control. Karoline sat motionless, jaw tense. She glanced toward her campaign manager in the front row, a young man in a tailored navy suit who frantically typed something into his phone. Was it an apology tweet? A threat to sue? A spin attempt? Whatever it was too late. The audience didn't care about optics anymore. This wasn't a campaign moment. This was a reckoning. In the front row sat an older woman, Esther Callahan, 74 years old, retired principal, widow of a Vietnam vet. She wore a thin gold necklace with a cross that had belonged to her grandmother, and in her lap sat a folded piece of paper with handwritten questions she'd planned to ask Karoline about education funding. She never stood up. She never raised her hand. Instead, Esther leaned over to the young man beside her, likely her grandson, and whispered, "That's what it looks like when someone expects your silence, and what it sounds like when they get caught preparing for it." He didn't respond. He just looked at her like he was hearing something he should have heard long ago. The moderator shuffled his papers. "Let's move forward," he said, his voice shaky. "We'll now pivot to federal policy." But no one listened. Even the cameras seemed slower now, like the room itself was holding its breath. Karoline finally leaned forward, her mic now working. That recording was from an internal meeting, taken out of context. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't even blink. Karoline pressed on. "Every campaign discusses strategy. Every office role plays difficult moments. That's not manipulation, that's preparation." The words rang out, but didn't land. Because across the auditorium, people were no longer listening with their ears. They were listening with memory, with all the moments they'd been told to stay calm, stay quiet, stay polite, only to be punished for it. One woman in the back row, Diane, a retired nurse from Delaware, stood up without being called on. She didn't yell. She didn't grandstand. She simply said, If that's how you prepare to speak to people like her, maybe you're not ready to speak for people like us. Inchoi, applause didn't erupt. It built, slowly, like an old engine starting again after years of stillness. One pair of hands, then another, then the back row, then the middle, then the sides. And Jasmine? She didn't move. She didn't raise her hands. She simply nodded once, as if to say, "Let the people speak now." In the booth, Maya watched through the glass, heart racing. She didn't care about the politics. She cared about what she'd seen. Someone standing up, not with volume, but with proof. Behind her, the director took off his headset and said quietly, "This isn't a broadcast anymore. This is history." And he was right, because outside the hall, the clip was already online, and the world was watching. Within minutes of the tape playing, Liberty Hall had become more than a debate venue. It had become a focal point for something deeper, a moment of national recognition. Not just for what had been said, but for how long people had been expected not to say anything. Outside, reporters crowded the steps. Inside, no one wanted to leave their seat, because something was shifting, and everyone could feel it. In Mississippi, a retired schoolteacher named Harold Watts watched the moment unfold on his iPad from a recliner in his den. He'd taught for 41 years. He'd heard that tone Karoline used 100 times, maybe more. "It's how they talked to us when we tried to get more books," he told his wife. "It's how they talked to the first black teacher we hired, smiling but slicing." In rural Pennsylvania, 3 veterans from the Korean War paused their weekly breakfast gathering to replay the moment. One of them, Joseph Harlan, 87, muttered through tears. It wasn't the tape. It was that she didn't even flinch. That's strength. That's what we fought for. So, back at Liberty Hall, Jasmine sat with her back straight, hands still folded. She hadn't spoken since her final sentence after the tape played. She didn't need to. Instead, others did. A local university student stood up in the audience. "I've watched political debates for years. I've never seen someone fight back without even raising their voice." Another woman, elderly, with a cane tucked under her seat, slowly stood up and said, "She didn't win an argument. She held a mirror." "Play down." Karoline tried once more to regain her footing. Her tone was slower now, rehearsed confidence cracking. "If we let our political discourse be defined by emotions, we risk making it personal, not professional." But the moderator didn't even acknowledge the comment. He looked toward Jasmine. "Would you like to respond, Representative Crockett?" She shook her head, and that no was louder than any speech. Across the country, the reaction didn't fade. It accelerated. The clip played on cable news, podcasts, live streams, churches. It was no longer about the specifics of the forum. It had become something symbolic. It became a conversation in families that hadn't spoken deeply in years. It became a sermon illustration in small-town churches, the moment when the voice, once dismissed, was heard by the entire nation. A conservative talk radio host from South Carolina, usually critical of Jasmine's politics, aired the full tape and simply said, "You don't have to agree with her policy, but if you can't respect what she just did, then you've lost the plot." A mother in Texas reposted the clip with this caption: "My daughter was told yesterday she's too sensitive to lead student council. I showed her this." In one corner of the internet, the hashtag #Xiaosachan heard her anyway began trending. Not promoted, not funded, just felt. On Capitol Hill, staffers whispered about the fallout. Could this impact Karoline's standing with donors? Could Jasmine gain bipartisan respect? Could a single moment shift the narrative? But to the millions watching, it wasn't about party lines. It was about dignity. And as one pastor from Michigan put it, that wasn't just a woman correcting another. That was history correcting a script we've heard for too long. In Liberty Hall, as the forum wrapped up, Jasmine finally stood. She didn't wave. She didn't give a statement. She simply gathered her things, nodded once to the moderator, and walked off stage. Not as a victor, but as someone who never needed to prove anything in the first place. The applause didn't explode. It followed her, soft and slow, like the kind you give someone who didn't just survive a storm, but stood in it, unbent. 2 days later, something rare happened. At a coffee shop in Asheville, North Carolina, a group of retirees who met every Wednesday for Bible study paused their usual opening prayer. One of them, Walter, an 82-year-old former firefighter, brought up the tape. "It was the first time in years," he said, "that I didn't feel like politics was screaming at me." They all nodded. Because what they had witnessed wasn't just political, it was moral. It was the power of restraint, the dignity of calm, the strength of someone who could have burned the building down with outrage, but instead stood still and let the truth speak for itself. And across the nation, that silence thundered. In a university ethics course in Ohio, a professor changed his lecture last minute. Instead of covering the scheduled topic, he played the 41-second audio clip and asked his students, "When does political strategy stop being clever and start being character?" Not a single student spoke for a full minute after the clip ended. A church in Georgia played Jasmine's closing line before the Sunday sermon. The pastor told the congregation, "She didn't shout them down. She didn't shame them. She showed them. And that, my brothers and sisters, is the way of righteous confrontation." At a senior center in Kansas, a small group gathered for their weekly movie night. But instead of a film, they replayed the debate. They didn't discuss policy. They didn't talk polls. They talked about their own lives, about the interviews where they were told they were too emotional, about the conversations they never got to finish, about the times they were dismissed, not because of what they lacked, but because of what others were unwilling to understand. The following week, Karoline Leavitt appeared on a conservative podcast. The host tried to steer the narrative, calling it an ambush. But Karoline's usual confidence had a hesitation to it now. She said, "I think the tape was edited unfairly." But the host interrupted. "Was it your voice?" She paused. "Yes." The host didn't follow up, because there was nowhere to go after that. The audience already had the unedited version, and they'd made up their minds. Jasmine Crockett released no statement. She didn't issue a victory post. She didn't gloat. Instead, on her official government account, she shared an image, a simple photo of a blank sheet of paper sitting next to a USB stick. The caption said, "For the moments they never expect you to save receipts for." And that was it. Underneath, thousands of comments poured in, from teachers, from veterans, from single mothers, from retired pastors, from women and men who had spent decades being told they were either too soft to be strong or too strong to be trusted. They all said one thing in different ways: "We heard you, and we saw ourselves in your stillness." A week after the forum, a school principal in Montana stood up during a district meeting. "Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that silence is not always consent. Sometimes silence is the last thread of dignity a person has." And with that, she enacted a new policy. All student council debates must allow uninterrupted response time, because one moment had changed not just the narrative, but the rules. There are moments in American history that don't roar. They don't arrive with fireworks. They don't break through with chants or marches. They arrive quietly, through a soft breath, a still hand, a refusal to flinch. Jasmine Crockett didn't destroy her opponent. She dismantled a system of expectation. She didn't walk away with applause. She walked away having redefined what power could look like. And now, in living rooms, church halls, classrooms, veteran centers, and senior breakfasts across the country, people aren't just asking what happened that night. They're asking what might happen if they finally stopped apologizing for how they speak. If they stopped mistaking silence for submission, because for once, someone let the mic stay on. And the country? It didn't just listen, it heard. If this story reminded you of a moment when you were told to quiet down, to harden up, or to stay in your place, leave a comment below. And if you believe stillness can be strength, subscribe, share this. Let your silence be your power.